All right, Casey, why don't you go ahead and get that thing started, and we'll go from there, okay?
Good deal. Thank you. Good to see everybody here. I think it's been a pretty good morning of presentations, and I think what you'll find is a lot of those have tied in pretty well to date, and I'm going to try to take them to the next step and hopefully answer even a couple of the questions that were brought up previously. My name is Casey Bolton. I'm with a firm called Commonwealth Economics. We're based out of Lexington, Kentucky. We're a municipal advisory firm, and a lot of people wonder what that is. Really, it means that we advise communities, universities, and governmental entities on financial-related matters. But we actually operate a little less traditionally like most municipal advisory firms, in that we also do a lot of economic analysis, and we also advise private development companies as well. And so really what we do while we work for cities and counties, we also work for universities and colleges, we also work for private developers as well. And what all of those clients have in common is they are looking to develop some sort of project or finance some sort of initiative. So really what I like to say that we do is that we do economic analysis and project finance. So we work on a variety of different types of projects, from the industrial types of projects that you've heard about today from some of the presenters to, I do have a background in startup financing for startup companies and entrepreneurship, putting business plans together. But we also work on more quality of life type projects, trying to transform downtowns or build out some of those quality of life components that Chris and Beth both mentioned as part of really creating an ecosystem that people want to be in, whether it's bringing their company here or finding a place to live or retire. A lot of those get missed in communities, and so a lot of the projects that we work on address that need as well. Our company is a very small company. We were founded by a Center College graduate, and I'm a Center College graduate as well. So we do like being back in Danville and are glad to be here. We both have a background in economics, and our other two partners have backgrounds in more traditional municipal finance. They both retired from state government, ran the state's debt portfolio for a number of years, and then retired, and we brought them on board to work with us. And I'll tell you a little bit about why we did that later as you see how we start analyzing a project from the beginning in more of an economic way, and then build all the way up to actually issuing the debt that is needed to support the capital to start that project. When you look at developing a project, we try to analyze it from a number of perspectives, and really going stepwise from a community level. You've heard a lot about different community partners working together today, and really the number one step in anything is identifying the public policy objective that you're trying to achieve, whether that's to bring new business to a community or provide services. There's an end goal there, and what it really takes is a lot of people within the community identifying what that is. So we want to run through this list pretty briefly. We're really going to focus on items number 2 and 3. But when you establish that public policy objective, you then have to figure out how to implement it. How do you pay for it? And so one of the things that was asked previously is where do you come up with the matching funds? So there are a number of public resources out there. There are federal infrastructure grants available. You've heard about some of those. You've heard about the AARP funds that are out there currently that could be leveraged. There's also state grant programs out there that have been very successful, and there are local funding programs out there that you can leverage. One of the downfalls in Kentucky is we're very state-centric in terms of funding. A lot of your tax dollars flow to Frankfurt, and it becomes a pretty tough battle to get them back and invest them in your community. So what are those local funding sources, and how can you use those sources to close the funding gap that you might have identified in these projects, whether it's to build a road, whether it's you need more housing in your community, utility connections, whatever it is that wastewater treatment, whatever it is that the public sector typically provides, that you're trying to figure out how do you get this project built and pay for it, and what does that positive impact on the community? Does it lead to more jobs? Does it lead to more residents? How does that create a positive impact? Which is where a lot of that economic analysis comes in when you're talking about the public sector and whether they value an investment that they're making and whether there is going to be a return on that. Having that patient capital is key, but also analyzing and understanding the more non-quantifiable benefits of those assets is also very important as well. The other thing we're going to talk a little bit about is considering different project delivery methods. One of the things that you'll see, and anytime you're trying to solve a problem on a project, is identifying different ways to skin the cat. And the more flexible you can be as a community, the better chance you're going to have at having a successful project and getting it going and getting it off the ground. So as you run through those, you want to develop a strategic plan as to how to actually go about implementing that, create a bid process to get the private sector involved, and then the devil's in the details, defining those contractual responsibilities, who's going to build what is expected from each party, and then ensuring that there's accountability and transparency. Anytime you're talking about the public sector leveraging their resources to incentivize private growth, you want to be sure that everybody's holding up their end of the bargain. So really having a true partnership both among the different branches of the public sector, the government, the universities, but also from private company to understand what everybody's role is and how everybody can work together to make a project come together. So I've used the word public-private partnership. What is a public-private partnership? One of the things that we often say, getting back to the skinning the cat, is if you've seen one public-private partnership, one P3, you've seen one P3. Rarely are they, it's not really formulaic. Rarely is one just like another. There are a lot of different needs or different objectives from one project to the next that require that deal to change or shift somewhat. And so really what we encourage everybody to do is think open-mindedly, leverage that entrepreneurial spirit, and be willing to work with the community to identify how you might adjust your traditional thinking as a community or as a private business to fit the needs of that project, and how you might change how you implement it, how you view the rules, how you spend your money, and be sure that you are working towards the same goal. It is a contractual arrangement. There is a formula in some extent, but it can change from project to project. You really are trying to identify those risks that have also been spoken about multiple times today and figure out how to align those risks with incentives. The number one rule that we learned at Center with economics is people respond to incentives. If you can align the risks with those incentives, you can create a more efficient project. And that efficient project delivery will spur more growth in your community because other businesses and entrepreneurs and those site selection groups will see that success and come to your community and know that it's a great place to do business. They're willing to invest in themselves, and they see a lot of return on that. It's more than just transferring a private asset to the public sector. It's a whole lot more complicated than that. It's really about leveraging the expertise of the private sector to get a project done. So when we talk about that partnership between the public and private sector, it really is about aligning those roles and those risks and those responsibilities. So this is just sort of a graphical representation of what you might see in a traditional design bid build structure where the government has an idea for, let's say, a wastewater treatment plant. They need more capacity for an industrial tenant that they think they can attract. Normally, the public sector would hire an architectural, put it on our RFP, hire an architectural firm, or sometimes design it in-house, but design the facility that they need. Then they go out to bid and figure out who can build it the cheapest. You have to then have an RFP process for that, and then you figure out who you're going to hire, and then they go and build it. That's a very basic process, and I was a little self-serving in my question earlier. That takes a lot of time. There's a lot of time that goes with that, and the slower you move, the more burden you place on the private sector, the more burden you place on everybody, the more cost there is to the project. So as you shift some of these risks and responsibilities towards the private sector up the arrow, the goal is to minimize the overall cost of the project, whether it's time-related, value, quality, things of that nature. And the more that you can shift these responsibilities to the private sector in an efficient way, hopefully overall process yields a greater result. So the next version of that would be to just do a design build, where the RFP would say, we want somebody to come in and design and build this project for us. And if you bring a team of an architecture firm and a construction firm, we can work with you a lot more efficiently to get that done. Who's going to operate it? Will that stay in the public sector, or will that go to the private sector? A lot of times the private sector can operate things more efficiently, but you have to be sure that those risks and responsibilities align to the benefit of the overall project. This is just another graphical representation of that. You can see the design, construction, operations, financing, and revenue, how those tie into the design, bid, build, design, build matrix here, where you're transferring some of those roles and responsibilities from the public sector to the private sector. And this is all really a broader way of talking about incentivizing projects within your community or getting public projects built. It doesn't have to be simply funding a project. There are different ways to go about funding that project that create a unique partnership and creates overall efficiencies throughout the process. While the public-private partnership, just to mention, it was codified a few years ago in state statute to allow things such as unsolicited proposals from the private sector to take that entrepreneurial spirit and say, we know that there's this problem within the community. We have a solution. We would like to offer our plan as to how we can have cleaner water in our community. So it is codified in statutes that allow that conversation to start happening. But also what is codified in the statutes in the state of Kentucky are specific ways in which not only state government, but also local governments can directly incentivize and help these types of projects, even if it's not in what you would traditionally think of as maybe a public-private partnership. Anytime there is some financing component coming from the public sector, city government, county government, some nonprofit version of thereof, it really is a public-private partnership. So this is just going to look at a few different ways in which the local government can incentivize projects from a financing perspective by using things like tax increment financing, industrial revenue bonds, or the KBI program to offer financial assistance to a project that may need it. The tax increment financing program is the first one we're going to talk about. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with that one because it is a little more complex. But it really is, I would say, the most commonly used economic development tool in the state from a non-industrial perspective. In other words, if you have a project that you want built, generally quality of life related, this is a great program to do it. It really is meant to target areas of a community that have seen disinvestment or deterioration, or new areas of growth that have not yet been realized due to certain infrastructure constraints, roadway inefficiencies, lack of utility connections, things of that nature. The process needs to start at the local level. Statutes require it, so even if there is a state participation component to it, all of the heavy lifting happens at the beginning at the local level. So we're going to walk through a little bit about the concept and then talk about what that means for a community. A city or county can create a TIF district through creation of a local development area or a development area. And really what the TIF program does is it uses the increase in tax revenues within that district that are created once the project is completed as a financing tool to fund the infrastructure that was needed for that project to happen to begin with. One of the more traditional concepts of that would be a project that we see this a lot that needs a parking garage in order to have the density or to get the project off the ground in a way that allows it to be feasible and see the best value or use of that land. Sometimes there are significant demo costs related to a project, other public infrastructure needs like water connectivity, things of that nature. But in order to get that project off the ground where the private sector can see it as a feasible endeavor, you need something like that parking garage that does not fund itself. People are willing to pay for parking in some communities, and what we found is even if they are willing to pay for that parking, it usually only funds about half the cost of the garage at best. It varies from community to community, but there's always a funding gap. So we go back to what is the funding gap of a project and how do we fill that gap? Tax increment financing is a great way to do that, whether it's a garage, a wastewater treatment facility, sewer improvements, things of that nature. But it really is just identifying those tax revenues that the new project will create in an area that has otherwise seen little to no tax creation, identifying those and basically earmarking them for that infrastructure improvement. A couple of things it does not do: it doesn't change the way properties or businesses are taxed. There's no additional tax on those businesses. It doesn't create exemptions, and it doesn't put any other restrictions on the property necessarily. It doesn't allow them to skip any kind of zoning process or not have to get the permits for construction or licensing or anything of that nature. Really, if you are not the developer of a project in a TIF district, you might not even know that you're in a TIF district. There's no added cost to operating your business. You just locate there. So if you have a downtown area that could be more efficient or could see more activity and you would like to create that type of quality of life improvement, a TIF would be a great way to do it and use that increase in taxes that you wouldn't see otherwise to help fund the infrastructure to get the project off the ground. As I mentioned, in the traditional P3 arrangement, it is all a legal agreement. There's a whole process that you have to go through to establish a TIF district. Try not to get too far into the weeds on that, but it does require the city and/or county to approve an ordinance that creates the TIF district. It all has to go before the city council or the county magistrates or fiscal court. As a part of that, you would identify which taxes are to be participated in that TIF district. Whether it's just property or occupational, to what extent those taxes are participated and what they're to be used for. So it's not a scary process because you really understand what it is that you're getting into, what project you're trying to incentivize, and what you're willing to expend on as a community in order to see that project happen. It's also very self-policing in that if the taxes aren't created, there is no funding source. So if you have a private developer that's building the project, if they aren't successful, if they build a project but nobody's there spending money, oftentimes they're the ones that take the risk that tax revenue, that lifted tax revenue is generated or not. So we go back to tying the risks and responsibilities to incentives. The developer then has every incentive to make sure that project gets built and is successful and is bringing people to the area and doing exactly what it was intended to do. As I mentioned, those TIF revenues can be used to promote one or more projects within that development area. There are certain project costs that it can be used to pay for. All of that is laid out in the ordinance and the local participation agreement. So I mentioned local taxes eligible to be pledged. At the city and county level, you can participate your property taxes and your occupational taxes, net profits taxes, payroll taxes. You cannot act, a city cannot act to have another taxing district's dollars pledged. You can't have the water district or the health district pledge their or the library district pledge their taxes. They would have to actively act to participate their incremental revenues or some portion thereof as well. You also cannot utilize school taxes or fire district taxes if you have those. So those are protected in the TIF statutes themselves. It's usually a 20-year term. It can go up to 30 years. But identifying those increased taxes, obviously the longer term you have or the greater participation, the quicker you fund those costs and the more impactful it is. But as a community, you'd have to weigh that against the pros of the project. There are a few state participation programs, and I'm supposed to focus on the local piece of it, so I just wanted to go over that really quickly. There are 3 programs at the state level that allow some state dollars to come back to your community if you do qualify for different pieces. There is one that is solely the state property tax that could be rebated to the project. It has a lower threshold of what you actually have to have in terms of scope of the project to qualify. There's also a mixed-use program that allows the property tax, but also state withholding taxes and state sales taxes to be pledged back to the project in your community. And then there's a signature project program that has a pretty heavy lift on qualifying. You have to have a $200 million or more project, and that also allows property sales and income taxes, but for up to a 30-year period, whereas the mixed use and property tax programs are only for 20 years. Another important piece to consider is that when you pledge those taxes to a TIF district, they can't be used to incentivize projects in any other way because they have been pledged to fund that infrastructure need for the project. So if you have a manufacturing company or a tech company that's looking to locate in an office project that you've incentivized with tax increment financing and the withholding taxes are pledged to fund the parking garage, you cannot also use those as an incentive to subsidize the rent for that office tenant or for the industrial developer. And there are a few programs out there that specifically do that, particularly at the state level and the local level. The KBI program is one. There's a Tourism Development Act program that pledges sales tax back to the private operator of a hotel or some other project that is tourism-based. And then we also will go over another incentive program that actually abates taxes. So if you aren't generating the taxes, again, you can't pledge them to a TIF incentive. There are a few projects that I just wanted to buzz through. You've probably heard about them. They are all TIF projects that have been successful. In Kentucky, there's the Omni Hotel project in Louisville, Kentucky. The main impetus of that was that they wanted more hotel rooms, more meeting space, and a higher quality of hotel room right there next to the convention center. So the city of Louisville put that TIF together. There's their new soccer stadium district that they're now playing games. They started about a year ago playing games there, and they're going to develop the land around that. The City Center project in Lexington, if you know where Jeff Ruby's is, that whole block is a TIF district. The Summit at Fritz Farm, the Ovation project in Newport, Kentucky is now underway, and they have a concert venue that is the first tenant there, and they are redeveloping that whole riverfront. And then a number of projects in smaller communities around the state. Owensboro has seen great utilization of the TIF program. They've redone their entire downtown waterfront as sort of the first step of that, and we'll talk about how they did that a little bit later. And then they piggyback that with the TIF program as well to get the International Bluegrass Museum there, to build some parking garages throughout the district. And they are working to incentivize a third hotel to support their convention center there as well. Ashland redid their downtown hotel with a TIF district. They now have a Delta by Marriott there. Paducah recently was approved for a TIF, and they have a new hotel and mixed-use project going on downtown adjacent to their convention center. So this is a great way to incentivize development in your community while also keeping some requirements on the private developer and ensuring that those risks and responsibilities are aligned appropriately. This is a case study of the Summit at Fritz Farm in Lexington. If you're familiar, it's a mixed-use shopping complex there. It started out as a $156 million project. It's actually over that now. It did have $31 million in public infrastructure. One of the key issues they faced on that site is they have a ton of stormwater runoff from Nicholasville Road and from the properties adjacent. And it was, if they were to develop that site, it was already creating a significant burden on the neighborhood there, where they were having stormwater overflow issues. Lexington was under an EPA consent decree where they were having combined sewer overflow issues, where it was creating an environmental hazard. This project used TIF incentives from both the city and the state to come in and clean some of that up, even downstream in the neighborhood, and also put the sewers and retention basins and things necessary in order to make that project a success. It resulted in a project that I think everybody there really enjoys. It brings people from all over the state, and even out of state. We have a client in West Virginia that comes just to go to the summit because they like the shopping there. So they come in and they'll spend the weekend and go to the summit. So it's very interesting. But to bridge that gap from start to finish, we were able to take that TIF incentive and sell bonds in the market using nothing but that revenue stream to fund those sewer improvements. So the city did not come out of pocket for any kind of debt or obligation other than if you build this project as you say you're going to, and it creates the occupational taxes, it creates the state sales taxes and other things of that nature, we'll rebate that to you for up to 20 years. And to the extent that you can leverage that in the market and sell bonds, you can use those to fund the sewer improvements. So we were able to do that with just the TIF revenues, no mortgage on the property, and generated a little over $14 million in proceeds for construction of that project. So that's how you can see the TIF program kind of come from start to finish without too much burden on the local community necessarily. Other communities, as we talked about previously, some communities have different advantages, different risks, different needs that they might need to meet in order to attract a private employer or a private developer. So you'll see from community to community the amount of risk that the community is willing to take on to incentivize these projects may shift. In Lexington, they feel like they don't need to take on that risk. They can put that burden on the private developer. In Owensboro, they have been kind of 50-50. On one project, they put a lot of that burden on the developer, and on their downtown project, they have taken a lot of that burden to build parking garages and incentivize development where they are the ones taking the risk that the TIF revenues will generate what we believe they will. So it varies from community to community. Ashland did take some of the risk on their parking garage related to their hotel. So it really just is a matter of identifying what the community's needs are, how invested they are in the project, and what you're willing to do to make a project happen. One of the other programs we talked about briefly was industrial revenue bonds. This is the program that I mentioned that is an abatement of property taxes. The first thing we want to make clear is that an industrial revenue bond is not necessarily a debt of the city or county or community. It is really just a mechanism for a project to avoid property taxes to some extent. And again, it's all about lowering that cost of the project so that it incentivizes a developer to make the project happen where they wouldn't otherwise be able to do the project. So really how it works is the industrial revenue bonds are issued by the city or county as a conduit issuer. And what that does is it takes the property off of the tax rolls, because if the city or county owns the property, holds the title to the property, it's not subject to property tax. What then happens is the developer develops the property and uses the property for a defined term, and at the end of that period, they retain title to the property and it goes back on the tax rolls. So really, it's just a complex way to lower the cost of the project to a developer or a business entity that is trying to build a project and locate in a community. And you can, similar to a TIF, you can negotiate what they call pilot payments, payments in lieu of taxes, that do make some of those taxing districts a little more whole. You may say, based on your project, we're going to have to still provide a significant amount of services to your project, so we want you to still pay 20 or 30% or 40% of what you would have paid had the project stayed on the tax rolls. So that's a good way to negotiate a project. Again, find the way to skin the cat, find the numbers that work for the project, and have different sectors of the community come together to make the project happen by incentivizing it in that way. It doesn't affect anything related to the occupational taxes, doesn't affect anything related to any sales taxes. It's simply ad valorem real property taxes that are impacted. The KBI program we mentioned as well, it's heavily used for industrial types of projects, manufacturing, service-related projects out of state, whether it's a tech company, headquarters, that's really focused on serving out-of-state population. There are a couple of other caveats, particularly that were just added recently, other types of projects that can utilize the program. But really what it is a rebate of that payroll tax, that occupational withholdings tax that is generated by a project. And it's a way to incentivize that company to locate here. Again, we talk about looking at the overall cost of doing business in a community. One way to lower that cost is by incentivizing the project through things like a KBI program. So particularly when you're talking about an industrial project, this goes into Beth's formula at the end. Maybe if the overall cost of doing business in a community is a little too high, this is a great way for a community to identify projects that they want and to lower that cost to that company under certain terms and agreements. If the jobs are generated, if you pay these taxes, we'll give you some of them back. Again, it can't be used with the TIF program. Those taxes can only be rebated once. So if you have a master developer or somebody that wants to come in and build an industrial park and they say that they need a rebate of those occupational taxes to cover roads or utilities or gas connections, you then can't turn around and give those same rebates to the companies that locate there. So you have to be mindful of where you're allocating those incentives. That developer can pass some of those benefits on, if it's through a TIF or some other program, to that tenant through the form of lowered rent, lower cost of rent, or maybe it provides a service that they needed anyway. But that's just something that needs to be taken into account there. The state program, if you would like state participation through that, requires a local match of up to 1% of your local occupational taxes. That can be some combination of city and county, or city or county. That's sort of up to the local community to work together and figure out. But you can participate as much as you'd like as a local community. And I think that's something to keep in mind as you think about this. The cities and county have great flexibility in how you spend your dollars, whether it's coming from the general fund or some other specific tax. You do have a lot of flexibility in what you see in your community and how you invest it. It obviously has to go before the council. Council has to buy in. Fiscal courts have to buy in. But you do have the ability as a community to identify needs and spend your money accordingly. One of those ways is through direct project investment. That's a little outside of the traditional incentive box we're talking about. But identifying funds in a general fund to build a road is one way to do it, or to build a parking garage. A lot of communities have parking authorities that do just that. They're funded through different tax revenues from operating the parking garages, even nonprofits. But we also wanted to just mention some of the other tools that local communities in Kentucky may have to fund projects like that. There's the transient room tax option that really can be utilized to fund tourism-related activities. It's an additional tax on your room tax if you stay at a hotel. So the great news about that is it's oftentimes a tax that people outside of your community are paying, and they're used to paying it. You probably wouldn't even recognize it on your bill. And that goes to fund a lot of times the projects that they're going there to see anyway, whether it's meeting space or convention center, or whether it's funding advertising for an event. There's also the local insurance premium tax that's often utilized. That really is how Owensboro kicked off their downtown redevelopment initiative. They raised their insurance premium tax and earmarked a portion of that to fund their redevelopment of the riverfront. I'm pretty sure most, if not all, of the council members that voted for that were voted out the next election. And then the project took shape, and several of them were voted back in, including the mayor. So they took the risk as political operatives to have that vision, even though the community maybe wasn't fully bought in, but it led to a great community asset that they have. They've attracted businesses downtown from out of state. as a result that want to be in that community. So that's a good revenue source that local communities do have to use as well. Fourth and fifth class cities, somebody mentioned the restaurant tax earlier. That's used oftentimes to fund certain projects. I don't think Danville hits that qualification, but it is another revenue stream that local communities have at their disposal to fund things. Elizabethtown, if you're familiar with their sports park complex, they funded a lot of that using the restaurant tax. And then, of course, there's federal grant funding that the city or county can be a liaison, oftentimes has to be a liaison to apply for certain things like what was formerly known as the Tiger Grant to fund transportation infrastructure is now called the Build Grant. Other programs like that, there's water and sewer, and then of course with all of the stimulus that's happening right now, there are going to be other funds out there available that cities and counties can use to fund projects directly or use as matching funds for state programs or other private investments. There are other ways to encourage investment. We talked a lot about or have heard a lot about it, working together as a community, identifying different partners. I think working together within city government or county government, or the city and county governments working together to make that burden for a new industrial project or a new developer coming to the community as little as possible, help them answer their questions, solve their problems for them before they have to address them. The shorter time frame they have to go through anything like zoning or working with the wastewater or water treatment plant or utility companies. If you have somebody in your community that can work together to identify those needs on the front end, tell them why that's not going to be a problem, work through any issues on the front end, and just lower that time to project delivery for them, the better off you'll be as a community. And that's something that you can do without expending a dollar. It just takes time and effort and coordination at things like coffee, once a month, or anything you can do to bring everybody in the community together to be aware of issues and problems and ways to solve them. Those strategic partnerships go a long way. Even, I think Beth mentioned just having that buy-in from the community, having a county judge and a mayor and people within the community that are excited to have you there and can work together to solve a problem and not be brought into bickering. We travel into a lot of communities around the state, and it's interesting the dynamics that you see in different places, but one thing that is consistent is the places where we see the most success, everybody's working together. The city and county, if there's an issue related to fire or ambulance services or things like that, those get solved, and they don't bring those into the realm of things that an industrial tenant needs to think about when they're going through the site selection process. So those are just some ways, non-monetary, that you can work together to incentivize projects and make it more likely that your community will see investment in that way. So hopefully that tied a lot of the themes together that we've had over the past few hours, and I'm happy to take questions from John and anybody else that might have stirred up some questions or thoughts, and we'll get them answered.
This is like my wheelhouse right here, so I'm jacked about this presentation. First of all, anybody have any questions for Casey? I've got a few comments to sort of highlight some things. One thing I think that's worth noting related to the presentation that Casey just gave you all is, that presentation that he gave you was meant to spur thoughts and catalyze thoughts in your minds about how to get things done. None of what he just told you should be expected to remember. He is here to help you all, and there are many others that can help you all through that process. I mean, I can tell you that, at my time with the state for 9.5 years, I dealt with certain people in certain communities, and we talked about the KBI program ad nauseum every week. And some of those local community members still didn't know that program. So I say that just because you shouldn't have any anxiety as you're sitting there like, how am I supposed to remember how to get that thing done, right? Just think about it in the context of there are tools and assets and programs to help catalyze developments. I think that's kind of the first thing, right? The second thing is all of the programs that Casey just talked about are potentially giving up or negotiating future revenues that you don't have today in many cases, all right? Increment financing, giving up taxes that you don't have today. The KBI program, giving up local occupational tax that you don't have today. IRBs, industrial revenue bonds, giving up property tax that you don't have today. It's all a negotiation. And you're not dipping into your current services by using any of those programs. I can tell you, and Casey probably has far more war stories than I do, there are communities that just don't understand, they feel like they're giving things away to people. It's some of these things will never happen if you don't use these programs to help make them happen. I think that's a very important thing for people to remember in here today, right? These are catalytic type programs. So use them to creatively foster ideas and planning and developments, okay? And again, future revenues. Secondly, these are also not entitlements. So you can negotiate all of this stuff. Tax increment financing, industrial revenue bonds, the KBI program, it's all negotiable. You don't have to give up 100% of all of everything. That shouldn't be the starting point, probably. I think the starting point, and Casey made this while he was making the presentation, is developing a plan, figuring out what problem you're trying to solve, using the future tax revenues to help solve some of those problems. Future tax revenues that you don't have today. And eventually, the terms of these programs are going to end, right? Tax increment financing, 20-year span. That sounds like a long time. IRBs, 20 years, 30 years, sounds like a long time, but they will end, and those revenues will come on board eventually if those projects are successful. That you can also, correct me if I'm wrong, Casey, in some cases you can, with an IRB, you can negotiate a declining scale of giving up the property tax. So you don't have to give up all of it all the time for the entire 20 years, am I right?
That's correct, yeah. Yeah, there's more than one way to skin the cat, and like I said, every deal is different, the rates are different requirements from different components. I think the other thing to keep in mind is there are a lot of tax revenues that will occur outside of the walls of that industrial tenant. You have people in your community that buy homes that are not necessarily in a TIF district, so you're going to generate more property taxes there. The insurance premium tax doesn't necessarily go that route. Tangible property taxes. There's a lot of utility taxes, other benefits from using some of these tools to incentivize development that ought to be taken into consideration in that formula as well.
I'm going to clarify something he just said. Taxes on utilities, not utility taxes.
Correct.
We don't get to keep those. So I think those are all important points for everyone to consider in the room today. These are catalytic things. The other thing that I think I would point out is, again, Casey highlighted this, successful projects really occur in communities where there is buy-in, there's strategy involved with it, there's a project development plan, and everybody's kind of speaking from the same page. And Madison has been through these programs and these projects ad nauseum. The very successful ones that happen in Owensboro, Madison was a part of those things. So, that alignment, the strategic development, I like the idea of, having coffee, caffeinating together, kind of working through these things, and that's where successful projects are born. I can tell you, and again, he has far more stories than I do, some of these things just get into a quagmire, and some of the programs are so difficult to understand that it creates anxiety and stress within the communities, and then you can't get the project done because everybody's worried about the meticulous language in the statute versus thinking about what are we trying to accomplish here. And I think that's a really, really important point to make and just to remind everybody. Anything on that? You want to add any other color or context as to what not to do? Again, that's probably an hour-long session in of itself.
No, you got it. I would just, one thing that you said is we can help you analyze and figure out how to get a project done, but one of the things that you know best as a community is where your assets are, where your problems are, what you hear from businesses that come here and say you just don't have enough of X or Y. The more that you all can identify those problems, our job is to kind of help you figure out how to put the financing together and solve them.
The final point that I will make, you know, you have to designate your negotiator in this community, okay? Whoever your negotiator is needs to be the point person. I've been to communities where there's not necessarily alignment in who's the spokesperson for the negotiation. And that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be conversations that go on or that there are processes created to say, you know, I know there are some communities that set up their local incentive negotiations by various project sizes. So if it's 50 jobs or under, we're going to do X, or if it's 100 jobs or more, we're going to do Y. And so they set the parameters to empower the negotiator to be able to go into those things with a high set of confidence, right? There are some communities that really don't know, and it's a case-by-case basis, and which is a very difficult position for any one person to be in, because some of these projects are trying to make decisions, right? And they don't want to have to wait on the debate that's going on in the back room locally to try to figure out what it is that we're going to do to incentivize this project. So I think you have to have a chief negotiator, and in some cases that chief negotiator has other job responsibilities, right? I'm not telling you who it should be, but you should have a chief negotiator. And so I'm going to have a little fun with this, and I'm going to share a story. And again, it goes back to my, you know, kind of project experience. I was in a community on a site visit, a final site visit. We had been, you know, this was an Austrian company who doesn't understand kind of the, you know, local things that are going on, or even government or taxes really in the United States. We're trying to bring them along with that, right? They've got a consultant with them, and we're down to the final site visits. We're maybe like one or two or three left. And I'm making a presentation in this community together with the community about the KBI program that we just talked about. And everything is about negotiation. So you want to give up as little as possible to get the deal done, right? So I'm starting from the bottom and I'm working my way up. We get to a point in time where we're sitting across the table from this Austrian company, very tight, conservative Austrian company, and we're making the negotiations, and I'm feeling good about it, and everybody's nodding. And the mayor in this community is sitting at the table, and he says, "How's that sound to you?" And they sit there quietly. It's uncomfortable. Negotiations are uncomfortable. They sit there quietly, and nobody says anything. And the art of negotiation is the first person that speaks loses. So that's why you got to have your negotiator sitting there. And nobody says anything, and the mayor says, "If he's not giving you enough, let me know and I'll call the governor." And I thought I was going to die. So don't do that, okay? And that's a very true story. There are others like it. I'm just saying, I personify that in so much as you guys are getting together as a community, or doing this symposium, you're thinking about things that are going to make you successful, the little things sometimes have an impact. So again, you got to have that chief negotiator at the table, empower them to make decisions in some cases, or have a process that's repeatable, that's set up so that they know how to get that decision made. I think that's very important. Okay? Any other questions or comments for Casey related to incentives? Does everybody, go ahead, Ray.
Let me just make one comment. Casey brought up that good point about designating certain taxes for certain projects and things. Please, communities, have the discipline that says, okay, I'm using this insurance tax premium, or insurance premium tax to fund this particular project. And when that project is done, either figure out another project you're going to use it for, or take it back off the table, because people get comfortable in throwing it back into the general fund, and next time you need to use it, you don't have it.
Right. Did everybody hear that? Okay. Very, very good point. There is a lot that goes on in this negotiating and incentives world, and using tools to help you finance things. So again, don't be overwhelmed by it. There are plenty of people at the Cabinet for Economic Development. There are people like Casey. There are people like me. We can all help with these things, and we're all on the same team to get them done. So Madison, you got a question?
Yeah, just and quickly, when it comes to programs that require local government participation, sometimes the state's hands are tied if the local government decides they don't want to participate fully. And it scales back what the state can do. So on the KBI program, for example, and I know in Owensboro, where I'm from, many years ago, there was a company that came in and bought an existing company. Because it was an existing company, the mayor at the time said, I don't think we need to give you a full 1% participation. Well, that company is in 3 other communities in Kentucky, and guess where they expanded in future expansions? Non-Owensboro. And so, so be prepared when the state comes in with the project to be a full partner with them, or to suffer the consequences, I think, of what future expansion may or may not do.
I mean, it's a great point. And, you know, in some cases, that end number that you, I mean, you know, in some of these cases, you're down to the very final. The tiebreaker is, you know, who's doing more in some cases, right? And if the state's hands are tied because, you know, there's not a good policy in place to completely support that project, and we're not negotiating from the bottom up, you may get eliminated. So all of these things, very important. And again, back to the point, find somebody who is that negotiator who understands the programs. Go ahead, please.
Since he's on that path, it's important to note that there are also fallback measures that can be negotiated as well. If that company doesn't hit those gates, then you get nothing.
That's correct. Everything's negotiable. What clawback provisions you put in there, you know, how you participate, all that kind of stuff is all negotiable. They're not entitlements. Okay, any final questions for Casey? Casey, good job. Thank you.
Thank you.